So what we're going to talk about briefly was we're going to talk about a little bit about the history of autism, what it is. We're going to look at the DSM-5, which is the current way we diagnose autism. We're going to look at known risk factors, and we're going to talk about a few facts. Myths, it's going to be really short because I just really wanted to debunk 2 myths. And then what happens after we get a diagnosis? So I think that this is probably one of the most important slides in my presentation, because this slide really answers the question, why are we having an autism epidemic? And this actually came from NPR, an interview that Terry Gross had on Fresh Air with Steve Silberman, who wrote a book called Neurotribes, and this was his interview. I happened to hear it, and it's become kind of my Bible. I have read it over and over and over, and it's just so informative. And so this information comes from his book, Neurotribes, and then I did some other research to complete the picture. But basically, in the 30s, Hans Asperger lived in Austria, and he was a doctor at the University of Vienna. And he started looking at individuals that had characteristics that seemed to go together. And those characteristics he later came to identify. He called it the autistic spectrum. Now, if any of you have taken psychology, you might have learned that Leo Kanner was the person who came up with autism. In fact, Dr. Asperger was the first one. And he opened up this incredible clinic that he created a kind of society of individuals, a safe place for individuals with autism to get the kinds of support that they needed. It was a very loving, a very kind, and a very nurturing environment. But it was the 30s, and as we know, in the late 30s, the Nazis invaded Austria, and the kinds of individuals, the types of individuals that were targeted were the intellectuals, and certainly he was one of them, and also individuals with disabilities became targeted for the eugenic programs to rid society of individuals with disabilities. So because of that, 200,000 children and adults with disabilities were murdered. And it was a very tragic event. So now move forward to 1943. And this is just 5 years later. And Dr. Kanner was also Austrian who had come to America. And so a lot of Austrian doctors were finding their way to America to join Dr. Kanner's work. And he was the first to call autism, he called it early infantile autism. And he believed that autism showed up very early, and then it was done by about 5 or 6 years of age. Well, that's a problem because we now know that autism is also a neurological disorder, that the brain is different. I'll be showing you a slide later on. And Dr. Kanner did have an agenda. He was opening up a psychiatry business, and he was going to perform services for individuals who had this disability, and he also wanted to support their families. But his way of supporting them, he came up with the idea that the reason these individuals had autism was because they had refrigerator moms. He was the person to coin that phrase. Now, what that phrase was that he said that these parents were very cold and they didn't respond to their children. Later, years later, research came out about, specifically to do with mothers, about how do mothers respond to their children with disabilities, and not just individuals or children with autism. But the newest research tells us that mothers respond to their children based on this dialectical relationship, that it's bidirectional, that they give to the child, and if the child continues to not give back, they tend to give less. We also know that autism is inherited. There are now over 200 genes that we have identified that are part of autism spectrum disorders. 200. So it's not a single gene disorder, and it's not even a polygenic disorder. It is rather a multifactorial disorder, meaning that the environment plays a role as well. That's the physical environment, and that's the emotional and intellectual environment. So now we're up to that third circle, and Kanner said that autism was extremely rare, extremely, and he said it was a form of psychosis. So if you're wondering where some of the negative images about autism come from, this is where it came from the 40s. And then something happened. Dr. Lorna Wing, she came in the 70s. She lived in London, and she was the parent of a child, a daughter with autism. And she just didn't think that autism was so rare. She had her daughter, and she started looking around, and she said, I don't think it's rare. So she started looking into Kanner's work, and in Kanner's work, she found a reference to Dr. Asperger. So she thought, well, let me go to the horse's mouth. So she started reading Dr. Asperger's work. Well, Kanner had never transcribed Asperger's work because it didn't fit his paradigm. So she said, Asperger said it was a spectrum. And so she started working in the 70s to change the way that autism was diagnosed. She wanted to broaden the criteria and increase the potential that individuals could get a diagnosis and therefore get the support and help that they needed for their autism. So that's a very brief history of something that took place over many years, decades. So that is when the epidemic began. The DSM, now I'm going to give you a DSM history, and then you're just going to combine those two, because this really explains why do we have an epidemic? Is there something in the water? And one of the keys to having an autism epidemic at this point is the way we diagnose it. So I want to give you just a brief history. So I'm sorry, that's really small, isn't it? Sorry. I will be making these slides available to anybody on my webpage, so you can certainly download it. In 1918, the American Psychological Association, they created a manual to be used by mental institutions, and that was going to later become the DSM. And in that first manual in 1918, there were 22 categories of mental illness. And so then they needed to make it a little bit more formal. So in 1952, they came up with the DSM-1, and the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. How are we going to diagnose it? And in 1952, you think about the time. History is one of those wonderful things. History is part of every subject we teach. And sometimes I feel like I'm a history teacher, except I don't know it well enough. But in 1952, it was post-World War II. And we had many soldiers coming home with many troubling mental disorders. And so the DSM-1 decided to focus on the treatment of soldiers. At that point, remember that first manual had 22 categories, now 106. So that's a lot of categories. And then, not too long after, only 16 years later, it was no longer meeting the needs. So then they had the DSM-2 in 1968. Well, think about it. Think of what was happening in 1968. What was happening? Oh, well, yeah, that's a pretty open, isn't it? War, the Vietnam War was huge. And so in 1968, they added, now they are up to 168 different diagnoses. And one of the things that they did in that DSM-2 is that they changed homosexuality to a different category. No longer were they looking at homosexuality as a sexual orientation challenge, but rather an adjustment challenge. That later they changed that as well. Then in 1980, so now they're starting to change it about every 10, 15 years. So in 1980, they came up with the DSM-3. Now they have 265 diagnoses. Are you beginning to see how history plays a role in how we see mental illness and disorders? So, first of all, the three got rid of neurosis. It's not a problem anymore. And they added PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then they said, okay, that ego-dystonic homosexuality, which is the adjustment of one's sexual orientation, not the sexual orientation itself, but just how you're mentally adjusting to that in a negative way, they got rid of that as well. And this was, the DSM-3 was when things changed in the world of autism. Because in 1980, Dr. Lorna Wing had been working with them to change the criteria for autism. And now it broadened it. It took it from a very rare disorder to now something, and that is very common. And you're going to see that in the statistics chart that I show you in just a moment. And then 14 years later, the 4 came out, and now we're up to 297 diagnoses. And the DSM-4, the big change that it had is no longer were they calling individuals the schizophrenic man, the autistic woman, but rather it's more client-centered because the world of psychology and psychiatry talk about clients, and in the world of development we talk about families and individuals. But the language now changed. So how we talked about individuals changed. What's very interesting is in the world of autism, it hasn't. And it's been a purposeful retention of saying autistic individual. And in child development, we continue to use people first language, talking about the person first and then the language. So when you read a lot of things or hear it on the news, you will continue to hear autistic child. In child development, we will continue to say child with autism because we think the child is the most important part of what's going on. And the autism is secondary to being a child. How you see individuals is really important because it influences and informs how you treat them as well. And then the DSM-5, that's the one we're currently under. It was influenced by Dr. Stanley Greenspan. And Dr. Greenspan is who I worked under for 5 years and trained under. And he will go down, probably, he will be the Asperger, he will be the Kanner of this generation because he was brilliant. He died a few years ago. And I studied under his faculty member, Dr. Rick Solomon, who has a center down in San Jose. So with the 5, oh, this is moving, isn't it? That would make me seasick. Now the 5 has over 300 diagnoses. What is different? Well, what's different is we now use the language autism spectrum disorders. That's it. Gone is Asperger. Gone is PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And that's the diagnosis that many children were getting because we knew they were quirky, but they didn't fit the full autism requirement, so they got PDD-NOS. Now, with the autism spectrum, they don't have to meet a certain number of criteria to get on that spectrum. Also, what has become obsolete is the language high functioning and low functioning. You'll still hear people say it, but those are people who are less informed and are not staying current in what's currently going on. The DSM-5 has been around for 3 years. So people who are working in that field should be aware of the language that we're using. So what do you do if you can't say high functioning and you can't say low functioning, but you're trying to make a distinction when you're working with an individual professionally? Well, they gave us kind of a safety net. We have levels of support that the individual might need. There's level 1, level 2, and level 3. And this is too small to read, but I just wanted to show you that there's lots of language out there. You can Google all of this information. And what you're going to find in just a moment, the DSM-5 talks about 2 core deficits, but we generally talk about 3. But the ones they're going to talk about is with autism spectrum disorder is that there are social communication challenges and there are restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. But when you talk about social communication, it's really covering 2 birds because there's social impairment and then there is communication impairment. So with level 1, the individual requires support. But these are individuals that are functioning in our everyday society. You might think that the individual is a little odd, and in our classes, we have many individuals with autism in our classes. Sometimes they self-report. I had somebody self-report this semester on the first night of class, and I later talked with them and said, thank you for sharing that with me, because it also gives me an opportunity, because I understood immediately that this individual was probably on the spectrum. Why? Because they blurt out inappropriate things sometimes. They overshare, or they might be sitting in their desk and they don't want anyone else to touch them. They sit in the back, they don't want anyone else around them. There's lots of behaviors that are kind of little red flags for me, and if I see several of them, then it really hurts me as an instructor when I suspect that someone's on the spectrum and others in the classroom are treating that individual with disrespect because they are saying things that are inappropriate. And they might dominate the conversation. And you have to figure out ways as an instructor, how can I rein them in, support them, make them feel important, and respond to the entire group. I teach large classes like this. So the first level are for those individuals. They need support, but there's a lot of independence. Level 2 is where they need substantial support. These individuals may or may not live independently. Probably level 2, they're going to be living with somebody because they need that kind of support. They're going to need support services from the community. And I'll share with that in a moment. And then level 3 is that they need very substantial support. These are individuals who probably cannot be left alone for very much time. They might need someone to translate their behavior, to translate their needs to the surrounding environment. These are individuals that are going to require support. And if they're not living with their families, they will be living in some type of supported living. So all of this takes me this long to get to this. So it was 150 not too long ago, then it went to 110, 1 in 110, 1 in 88, and now it's 1 in 50. That's the current numbers that are coming out from the group called Autism Speaks, which is probably the leading authority of accurate information regarding autism. So the rates are increasing. Do you want to know why? Well, okay, I gave you that history. So remember I took you to 1975, but do you know what? In 1970, 5 years before that, it was 1 in 10,000 because we were operating off of Dr. Kanner's very narrow criteria. So it was 1 in 10,000, then it went up, and you see as the DSM changed, because I gave you that history, now you start seeing. So one of the big factors in the autism epidemic is the way that we diagnose it. It's now more inclusive of individuals who need support. So here's this wonderful graphic that I found. I just love it. So we think that 25% of the increase is based on the different diagnoses. We also think that about 15% is because we have an awareness. Now, when relatives see a child, they go, I think there's something wrong. I saw Rain Man. I saw a movie about this, and now it's everywhere. And there are some really wonderful public education and public awareness campaigns. So now we have a greater awareness. Doctors are now doing what's called the MChat on children in the pediatric in their pediatric practices. Then we think that about 10% of it is connected to parents having children older. Now here's the big question. Is it correlation or is it causation? So, are more children being born with autism because their parents are older? Or is it more likely that individuals on the spectrum might take a little longer to find a partner? And we think that it might be more correlation. We definitely see a lot of children on the spectrum from parents who are in the high-tech field, fields where they're excelling academically and independently, a lot of independent jobs. And so maybe that's why. It may not be that having children older causes it, but correlated. We're not sure. We don't know. And then spatial clustering, and what that is we're starting to cluster things together and say, well, okay, this is probably autism. It used to be this or this or this, but now we're clustering them together, and so about 4%. 46%, we don't know. We don't know. And there are many great minds out there that are trying to determine what puts a child at risk for developing autism. I don't know if you heard this recently. This was about 2 months ago, I think. A new research about antidepressants that women take during pregnancy. Did you read that? Anybody? No? Yeah, oh, a couple of hands. Yeah, yes. Well, here's the problem. That research wasn't done very well. So it's really important to look at who's doing the research, how was the research conducted, what was the intent of the research, and how was that information disseminated? Was it disseminated through a reliable source? So when that came out, I heard it on NPR first, so of course I really quickly, it came out in Science magazine, and I went, and first I read just the brief of it, and then I thought, okay, this isn't enough information, so I got a copy of the whole research, and there's problems with it. There are real problems with it. So it's kind of one of those things, are individuals, mothers who are pregnant, who are taking antidepressant medications, are they taking that as part of their own medical protocol because they're medicating their challenges with autism, of which depression can be one of them? So it's complex. So don't take everything for face value, because definitely we don't think that that is one of the big causes at this point. Okay, now let's look at what it is. So we talked about the history. We've talked about maybe why it might be perceived to be an epidemic. What is autism? So we look at core deficits, and these are the things that at the root of everything, this is the challenge that the individual with autism has. Social interaction. I could go on for about 5 hours on social interaction. If you want to read a fabulous book, it's old, it's 1998, but it's by Dr. Lorna Wing, and it's called Autism Spectrum Disorders. But some of the challenges that the individual has with social interaction is they don't have the ability to change what they're saying to the audience. So when they're talking with a 2-year-old, instead of, talking at their level, stop doing that. Give me that. Don't do that. Something that they might say to a 10-year-old. But then on the other hand, they'll also say that to a superior. They might have that difficulty adjusting what they're saying to who they're talking to. They tend to have challenges with following the rules of communication and conversation. You take a turn and I take a turn. You take a turn and I take a turn. We don't interrupt. And yet, those rules of conversation aren't there. And even if you say, okay, we're going to take turns, it almost has to be something concrete, like the talking stick. Okay, it's my turn to talk. Now it's your turn. And that works really well, especially when we're working with the youngest children, helping them to rewire the hard brain so that those communication skills are there. They don't share interests. If I have a brief moment at the end, I'll share a brief clip that is on YouTube, but if I don't, it's Early Signs of Autism on YouTube. It's a 9-minute video. I was only going to show you a few minutes. But it's a great juxtaposition of what does autism look like in a young child. They'll show a neurotypical child, and then they'll show a child with autism of the same age. And they'll have them be doing the same activities, like what does the child do with a phone? And the child who's neurotypical will look at the phone, look at the person who's in the room, look at the phone, talk, hand it to the person, smile, have a conversation. And it's this ongoing, beautiful waltz with that child. The child with autism picks up the phone and puts it up there. Doesn't necessarily even play with it appropriately, but just is fixated. Might be fixated on pushing the buttons. Might be fixated on a sound that it makes or a light that it makes, which is why if you have young children, they don't need anything with a battery. They don't need it. They need Fisher-Price toys from 1975. So they don't share what they're interested in. A young child finds a bug and they're so excited and they pick it up and they bring it to you and they're like, look what I found. The child with autism will just look at the bug, and it doesn't occur to them to share it with you. And so one of the big red flags that we have, children by a year should be pointing and saying, look, shared interest. Look what I'm interested in. I want you to look at that. And also when I point, the child should be looking where I am, like, oh, what have you got? What have you got? But the child who doesn't do that at 12 months of age, it's a red flag. If they're not doing it at 15, it's a big red flag. The second core deficit is in communication. Now, you can't really read all this, so I'll tell you what it says. But the deficits in communication are, they have difficulty with nonverbal communication. They have difficulty with poor eye contact. But this can be kind of one of those things that is confusing to some people. Many children I work with who have autism, they make great eye contact. And so the parents say, what's the problem? I heard poor eye contact's the problem. Their child is making great eye contact, but there's not a lot of communication and engagement. They're just looking at me. They might like the color of my eyes. They might like the movement of my eyelids. They have difficulty with body language. They have difficulty reading it, and they have difficulty expressing it. They have difficulty understanding gestures. Many people have tried to teach individuals with autism sign language, and it's not real successful with most. Some it is, but with most it's a challenge. It's what I use as a last resort. And actually, in my 25 years of working with children with autism, I've only had success with sign language with one, only one. But I still try it just in case that's the child that it's going to work with. So sign language is not one of those fix-alls for children with autism. They also lack facial expressions, and they have difficulty reading your facial expression. And there's a diagram that I've seen that the individual, let's say a child who's 2, when they look at you and they're trying to read, they will look at over 150 spots in your face before they figure out what you're trying to tell them. Their brains are hardwired to do that. It's called social referencing, like, what should I do? What should I do? Look, and if the person that they care about, their primary caregiver, looks alarmed, oh, they're going to be alarmed. But if they think something's scary and their caregiver is smiling and saying, oh yeah, that loud sound, oh, that's a firework, oh, that's beautiful, woo, look at that. But if it's a loud sound and it's scary to the caregiver, the child is looking. Social referencing, sharing that emotion. The child with autism looks at about 3 places. And they look up here. There's not much going on up here. And they'll look over here, not much going on over here. And they'll look over here, and they might look at the chin. So they're looking at maybe 4 places, and none of them are the places that are going to give them a cue as to what's going on emotionally. So they not only lack facial expression themselves, but they don't give it back either. The third core deficit is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. And there's so many pictures I could have shared here. The one that seems to be very, very common are Disney videos. I follow a blog, this mother who's she writes a blog, you know you're the parent of a child with autism if. And one of them is, she says, if you know every word to every Disney movie. And And you know every Thomas the Train car. You know the name of it, and you know what they do. So Thomas the Train is one of those things that seem to be really, really common interest of children with autism. So does, for some reason, Toy Story. I don't know. Woody. They love him. They just love him. Elmo. So some of the things that you'll see now, what you'll see in this child up here is he's kind of flicking his fingers. And that's a real common behavior. Now, what can happen is, as a younger child, he might have been doing a lot of hand flapping, but he's learned to get it down, make it a little bit less obvious, and get it down like here. But you know what? You and I might do that. Any of you tap your foot? Bounce your knee? Bite your fingernail? Chew gum? There's a lot of behaviors we do to kind of control anxiety, and you say, well, I'm not anxious. Well, anxiety is just a little bit of stress, and that's what you're doing. That's what the child is doing. So some of the things that they could be doing in being restricted is objects. They might like an object. They have to have an object. And you look at the object and it doesn't make any sense. Like, why do they want that object? It is so ridiculous. There are so many interesting things that they have in their room. They also might have some difficulty with speech in that they'll do some what we call echolalia. You say, how are you today? How are you today? And they just say it and repeat it. They have the intonation, but it's kind of flat. There doesn't seem to be a lot of emotion. And I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. Lining things up like the shoes and in a particular way. And if they want to line them up this way and you want to line them up in this direction, no, it's not going to work. Idiosyncratic phrases. I knew this was a long time ago. It was CBS News with Dan Rather and Connie Chung. CBS News with Dan Rather and Connie Chung. Quilted Charmin. And those were just these idiosyncratic phrases that didn't communicate. And sometimes I'll work with a parent and a child because I do coaching. I call myself a coach, and that I'm coaching the parent in how to more effectively play with the child. And they say, but they're talking. They're saying, I love you. They're saying, what's up? And where is it? And go away. And I'm thinking, well, it's not really communicating an idea or a need or a want. It's just these kind of idiosyncratic phrases that they've learned that kind of get their parents off their back. And it works for them. They also, as part of this deficit, they insist on things being the same. And that can fall into many, many categories. They want to watch the same movie. They want to eat the same food. In that blog, she says, you're the parent of a child with autism when you don't have to make a grocery list because you're only buying 5 foods anyway. And they have this need for routine. And if the routine gets disrupted, there's an emotional meltdown, which is different than a tantrum. I'll explain in a moment. And rituals, like they might need, and part of this is where that clustering, they're putting things together. Instead of maybe being diagnosed with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where they have to tap 5 times before they touch that, then that's just part of this ritual that they've gotten into, that they have to do this before they eat, and it might take 10 minutes for the ritual. But the good news about rituals and those kinds of behaviors, repetitive behaviors, they're really easy in most situations to work with the child and broaden them. It just takes time and just patience and understanding. Again, repetitive behaviors, watching bubbles. And I mean, really, there's not a lot going on with bubbles going up, and yet they they might watch the bubbles go up for hours and hours and hours, and you say, well, look, he's smiling, he's happy. But there's no engagement. There's nothing going on in the brain to say, but what about those bubbles? And then I love this picture because this shows just a multitude of things going on for this child. He's not engaged with the world around him. He's got some sort of repetitive movement going on, and his face lacks expression. On this child, there's some really good stuff going on here. This child, we see children all the time on the spectrum that are laying on the ground. So when children want to lay on the ground and you're a teacher, it's okay. What they're trying to do is get grounded. They want to feel gravity. They want to feel the big sensation because they are what we call hypo sensitive. They have low sensitivity and they're seeking. So I would suggest, I would have to be there to be sure, but I would suggest that this child is seeking gravity. He's doing a repetitive drawing. He might like circles. Circles seem to be a shape that children on the spectrum really like. And then I would also suggest that he's looking at things from a different angle. You'll see children, they'll look at this and they'll look out of the side of their eyes and they kind of look like that and then they flip it. Well, I think that those are the children, because I've seen them now. I've seen them. Some of the children I worked with that did that, they are now 15 years old. These children are brilliant at math and spatial relationships and geometry. They get it. They understand space. Why? Because they spent several years doing this, looking at things like this. And they looked at things from all different angles. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think they're future engineers. That's what I think. And it's only because I'm seeing it happen. And that's the beauty of being in this field for a while, working with children and staying in touch with their families. You get to see what happened next. There are other deficits that a lot of people don't talk about. Theory of mind is one of them. Stanley Greenspan was the first to talk about it. He has the best, his floor time strategies are the best for responding to lack of theory of mind. And I don't have time to talk about theory of mind except to tell you, in a nutshell, it's kind of like thinking about thinking. Solving problems in your head. Daydreaming with a purpose. And the individual with autism doesn't have that questioning reflection going on, that theory of mind. And then the next deficit that we see is the inability to take someone else's perspective. Now, when I say all these things, it might sound negative. This is before there's treatment. After treatment, there are significant changes. So, here's the challenge. I've just given you all these things that individuals with autism might have or might not, but there's a range, which is why it's called a spectrum. When we look at social interaction, they could be aloof, or they could be all the way, but they're very active, but odd. And IQ. Now, today I just wanted to make sure that it hadn't changed, and I didn't see any change. The current literature still says that 70% of individuals with autism, the language they're using in the language that I'm finding is they're still using the language mental retardation. We're using the language intellectual disability. 70% of them have intellectual disability according to the literature. My personal experience is that 90 to 95% of them are not only typically developing in IQ, but in the gifted range. That's my personal. Now, I could be just getting really great children, but I've had children that when I got them, I was told that their IQs were under 50, which is considered in, when you look at the bell curve, that is really low, really low. And I'll spend 3 hours with them and go, nope, I don't think so. This child may not have language and they may not have the ability to move things around, but they're thinking about thinking. And theory of mind is what changes them, and they can start engaging in dramatic play. So IQ can be from severe to gifted. Communication can be nonverbal to highly verbal. Motor skills are another deficit. In many children, they can be very awkward and uncoordinated, or very agile and very coordinated. It's really the roll of a dice. Sensory, they can be hyposensitive, low, or hypersensitive, high. I'm going to go through these quickly because you might want to have questions. So boys and girls experience autism differently. They have a sensory profile. They have lights, smells, textures, tastes, sounds, touch. All of these things affect the individual, and they might be hyposensitive, meaning that nothing bothers them, to being hypersensitive to everything bothers them. There's lots of sensory hotspots that the individual will have. And then part of a lot of professionals aren't talking about this, but then you start working with occupational therapists and physical therapists. Occupational therapists especially will start talking to you about proprioceptive, which is understanding where your body is in space, like how do your joints talk to each other. And the need to have proprioceptive balance, to know where your body is in space. And vestibular, which is movement. So these two children, this is a child who's definitely struggling with proprioceptive, and so climbing. So if a child's climbing, that's a clue. They need to climb. So let's give them someplace safe to climb, because they don't have that ability at that age, certainly, to understand when it's not safe for them. And the child laying on the floor is not a child who needs to be reprimanded. It's a child who says, I am stressed, I need gravity. That's what they're doing. They're hyposensitive and they need lots of stuff. The child who's hyposensitive will shove food into their mouth, trying to feel that fullness that you and I get. So the strategy for that, give them crushed ice. Works really well. More proprioceptive, you'll see swinging. A small percentage of individuals with autism, they're the level 3, do self-destructive behavior, but it's not the norm. It's not the norm. So again, where is my body in space? Proprioceptive, and now we're going into emotions. There are differences between a tantrum and a meltdown. A tantrum is, I didn't get something I wanted or needed, and I'm really mad, and I'm going to tell you about it. A meltdown is, I've lost my ability to regulate myself. A meltdown doesn't go away in 5 minutes. A meltdown might last 2, 3, 4 hours. That's not a tantrum. And it's really important for people around children to understand that child is not being bad. You are not going to put them in timeout and that's going to go away. You are not going to send them to their room. You are not going to spank them and make them stop doing that. A meltdown is saying, my amygdala, my hippocampus, my limbic system is overwhelmed right now and I can't get it back. It's very challenging. So the brain is affected. I just want you to know that the limbic system is where we're really looking at what is going on for the individual with autism. Their brains are different. And it's primarily in the limbic system, the cerebellum, which is this bottom part of the brain that develops first after the brainstem, and it's about movement and balance. So that's why some individuals with autism, they're very, very good at motor behaviors and others aren't, because that cerebellum is affected. And then the amygdala, which is the we call it the fear center of the brain. And if the amygdala is smaller in the individual, they're going to have less fears. If the amygdala is larger, they're going to have a lot of fears and a lot of anxiety. And many children are now being told that maybe this isn't autism, maybe it's the amygdala. The amygdala has gotten too big, the child has unusual fears and has meltdowns because they don't know how to process their anxiety. And people are wondering if maybe it's related to an anxiety disorder. So definitely you can see the difference in the brains and the part of the brains, especially down in here where you're seeing the limbic system and the cerebellum and the brainstem. Few facts, go through quickly. Children are usually not diagnosed under 2, although Stanley Greenspan, and in working with him, I've now been able to identify with pretty decent accuracy by 6 months of age if there's something going on, with pretty good reliability. But what happens is, until the child starts moving, we don't know that they're that different. They just look cute and they're excited about toys, and especially if they've got a mobile that lights up and they're excited and they're happy and everybody thinks they're fine. But then when they're 2, oh, they're also supposed to be talking. Oh, they don't talk. So all of a sudden at 2, they're walking, they're not talking, and now we start diagnosing it. And then the diagnosis starts dropping off as they get older. But really, this age between 2 and about 17 is the big age, but really by 10. So some children are still not diagnosed at age 9 or 10 because they're kind of on this, they're on the spectrum and not enough things are showing up. Boys are more likely to be diagnosed. We think it's because more of them have it. We're not sure because we know it looks different in boys and girls. It can be reliably diagnosed by age 2. Intervention works. 1/3 of children with autism, no matter what intervention you do to them, are going to be nonverbal, 1/3. But that doesn't mean they're not intelligent. And that's the critical thing. And there's this wonderful, if you want to YouTube it, it's called Rapid Prompting System. And just YouTube it. And there's this woman who she taught her son how to use a communication device, and it turns out he's brilliant. He's brilliant. But he's flapping and he's doing all of this, and you go, boy, I don't think there's a lot of cognitive abilities there. And there are. And he's bouncing, and he's having difficulty regulating himself. He's having difficulty regulating his emotions and his body. Very bright. Autism-related gastrointestinal issues are real. But not every child on the spectrum needs a gluten-free diet. So it affects some. They're real. They are real. Sleep disturbance is real, it's prevalent, but that's one of the things that we can work really well with, but it's definitely there. 1/3 of individuals have epilepsy, and the best strategy that I've seen with epilepsy is to do a 24-hour EEG, not a 2-hour. And the environment plays a role, both positively and negatively. And half of children with autism run and bolt. So what can you do? Find support. Find other people that have children. Locally, if the child is under 3 and getting a diagnosis, Valley Mountain Regional Center is where you would go. If they are over 3 and you're seeking services for the first time, you would go to your school district. And once the child gets a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, they qualify for services through Valley Mountain Regional Center in most situations. Learn about your child's sensory profile. What sets them off? What can you do? How can you adjust your environment? One of my favorite Debbie-isms is, if it's not working, change the environment. Autism is a lifetime disorder, so plan for it to be lifetime. And meet other positive parents and read. And the last thing before I close, the myth that is the biggest myth that I want to debunk is it is not from immunizations. I can't tell you enough. There is so much information out there. But Dr. Wakefield was from London, and he produced a paper in, I don't remember when it was, 92? I think it was 92. And the paper said that autism comes from the mercury that's contained in the MMR. And he produced it it's called The Lancet, and it's their journal of medicine. Well, somebody tried to replicate it, they couldn't, and came back and said, this is wrong. Turns out he totally falsified the entire research. They withdrew it, but the damage had been done, the message was out there. He lost his license to practice medicine. Then he came over here to the United States. He found a very welcome environment. Jenny McCarthy bought into it. And Jenny McCarthy, in case you don't know, she's not a doctor. And so her support of his work is not a stamp of approval that you would want to rely on. Anyway, long story short, Dr. Wakefield has now lost his license to practice in 13 states. It's not from MMRs. It's not from vaccinations. They removed, thinking that that was true, they removed mercury from the MMR back in 1993. It hasn't been put in immunization since 1993. If you're worried, it's still used in flu shots. Don't get the flu shot. But it's not the immunizations. It might be other things. And finally, Temple Grandin says, I'm a visual thinker, not a language-based thinker. My brain is like Google Images. She thinks in pictures. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Say that a parent gives birth to twins. Can one twin be diagnosed with a level 1 and
Yes.
the other level 3?
Absolutely. And depending if they're monozygotic, meaning one zygote, or dizygotic, two zygotes, if they're two zygotes, one could have autism and one could not. But if they're identical and they're monozygotic, they could both have autism. They would most likely both have autism. But there's something called basic vulnerability of the fetus that creates a vulnerability that one could be level 1 and one could be level 3. Absolutely. And I've seen it personally. Yeah. I'm willing to stick around. Thank you.